In this video, I'm going to talk about basic terms in kinesiology of human musculoskeletal system. These terms help us to understand anatomic and biomechanical interactions in human body. Hello, my name is Hazheer. I'm second year physical therapy student in Turkey, city of Istanbul. If you're new to my channel, make sure to push the subscribe button because I'm posting videos every week. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to smash the like button because it will help me to create more useful videos. So in this video, I'm going to cover some important subjects. First of all, I'm going to talk about what is the kinematics and what's the kinetics and what's the difference between them. And after that, I'm going to talk about types of motion that we have in kinesiology and also types of kinematics that we have in kinesiology. And at the end, I'm going to talk about osteokinematics, which we will cover the subjects like plane of motion, axis of rotations, degree of freedom, and also different perspective around movements. So what is kinematics? Kinematics is a branch of mechanics which talks about the motions of the human body. And it has two subdivisions, kinematics of bones and kinematics of joints, which kinematics of bones are called osteokinematics, and also kinematics which happens inside the joint is called arthrokinematics, which today we're going to just talk about osteokinematics. So what's the kinetics? And what's the difference between kinematics and kinetics? So as we said, kinematics means that the movement of body, regardless of any force that creates that movement or creates that torque in the body. But in kinetics, we talk about the effect of forces and effect of torques on the motion of the body. So as we speak about motion, we have two types of motion. Either we have transitional motion or we have rotational motion. Transitional motion means that all the body segments are moving in parallel to each other. It's called linear or curvilinear. So as we move, our body moves, our tip of our head moves up, down as we go through the horizontal line. Our body also moves 5 centimeters up and down as we step. So our movement is basically curvilinear. The other movement that we have, the other motion that we have is rotational, which is a segment of a body that rotates around an axis or a point. For example, my forearm rotates around this axis, which is my elbow joint. And also in kinematics, as we said, we have two types of kinematics. Osteokinematics means movement of the bones. Osteo in Latin means bones and kinematics is motion of the body. But arthrokinematics talks about the motion inside the joint. The motions that happen in between articular surfaces in the joint. But today we're going to talk about osteokinematics mostly. So in osteokinematics, there are some terms that we have to know about them, which all the motions in body explained in that terms. So first of all, we need to know planes of motion. As you might know, the anatomical position of a human is standing straight, legs hip wide open, hands are externally rotated, palms facing forward, and hands are a little bit abducted, shoulders, and looking forward. So we have three types of planes of motion in the body. The first plane is sagittal plane, which cuts our body to right and left and passes from sagittal suture, which movements like flexion, extension, head flexion or trunk flexion and extension, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion happens in this plane. Second plane in body is called frontal plane, which passes from frontal suture in our skull and divides our body to the front and back, or ventral and dorsal, or anterior and posterior. So which movements are in this plane? Abduction, adduction, radial deviation or ulnar deviation, neck lateral flexions, trunk lateral flexions. Also in the third plane we have transverse plane. Rotational movements happen in transverse plane. And also inversion and eversion of the ankle joint happens in transverse plane. So by understanding these planes of motion, all the motions of the body are happening in these planes. Either they are happening in only one, or either they are happening in two and also three planes together. So as we stand, motions in our body are mostly rotational motions. So they are rotational motions which happen around some pivot point, or we can call it also axis. For example, for shoulder abduction, there is an axis here in my shoulder which my arm just like rotates around this axis. Also in elbow, we can say there is an axis here perpendicular to the plane of motion, which allows my forearm to like rotate around this axis. Don't mix this and don't forget about that. Every axis of rotation is perpendicular to the plane of motion. For example, in abduction and adduction motions, or in lateral flexion motion in the trunk, there is always an axis of motion, which, for example, in my shoulder joint, there is axis of motion in the head of the humeral bone, which is located around here, and it is located in sagittal point. Okay, so the sagittal point is perpendicular to the frontal plane, which movement is happening. Okay, and also rotational movements like shoulder lateral rotation, medial rotation, or like my head rotations is happening around an axis called vertical axis, which is perpendicular to the transverse plane or horizontal plane of movement. As we talked about plane of motion and axis of rotation, each joint in our body has its own degree of freedom. So what do we mean by degree of freedom? It means that some joints in our body have 2 axes or 3 axes or just 1 axis. So for example, my elbow joint has only 1 axis, which is here in frontal plane, and only does flexion and extension. Shoulder allows 3 degrees of freedom in sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane. Elbow, for example, allows only 1 degree of freedom in sagittal plane, flexion, extension. Wrist, for example, allows only 2 degrees of freedom in ulnar deviation or radial deviation and flexion and extension. So as we can understand, degrees of freedom in every joint means that that joint can move in different planes of motion, either 1 plane, 2 plane, or 3 planes of motion. And at the end, there is 2 perspectives around movements of a joint, either the proximal on distal or distal to proximal. So for example, in the upper extremities, my fingers are distal part of my upper extremity, and for example, my humerus bone is proximal part. And also in legs, it's same as well. So in perspective around movements, we also have 2 perspectives. Either proximal is fixed and distal is moving, or distal is fixed and proximal is moving. For example, when I'm sitting on a chair and standing, so my tibia is fixed, but my femur bone is moving according to the fixed tibia. So we call it proximal on distal. Another example in upper extremities, when I do push-ups or when I do pull-ups, my forearm is fixed, but my humerus is moving according to fixed forearm. So we call it proximal on distal. But in reverse, if I'm sitting on a bench, which I do leg extension movement to strengthen my quadriceps, for example, my femur bone is fixed, but my tibia and fibula bone are moving according to the fixed tibia. So what do we call it? Distal on proximal. Okay, so distal moves first on fixed proximal bone. So this is the place that open kinematic chain and closed kinematic chain terms comes in. So open kinematic chain, what do we mean by open kinematic chain? So as you can understand, and as we talked about the proximal on distal or distal on proximal, open kinematic chain means that distal part of our extremities, like our tibia and fibula or our forearms, radial and ulnar bones, are free and are open to movement. So our distal parts are free and are moving, and proximal parts are fixed. In closed kinematic chain, our distal bones are fixed and our proximal bones are moving according to the fixed distal bones. So okay, for example, in squatting position or in squatting machine, my distal bones, my legs are fixed on a ground which is immovable. Okay, or when I'm doing push-ups or when I'm doing pull-ups, my distal bones are fixed. So we call it closed kinematic chain. So there are also benefits of closed kinematic chain and open kinematic chain exercises, which I'm not going to talk about it today, which is a deep subject, and we will talk about it later on. But in order to understand the terms of open kinematic chain and closed kinematic chain, we need to understand the different perspective of motions in the body, and also understand which is proximal on distal movement or distal on proximal movement. So this is it for today. I hope this video was useful. If you liked and enjoyed this video, please smash the like button because it will help me to create more useful content. Until next video, take care and goodbye.